Shaitanir-Rajim. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursaleen. As Muslims, we always begin our conversation, our presentation, by first remembering Allah, or God Almighty, who is most gracious, most merciful, and we send peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and also the righteous people of the past as well. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Faizan, Syed. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, which is a chapter of the largest civil liberties and advocacy organization for Muslims inside the United States. And much of the work that we do is directly countering Islamophobia that exists within the country as we know it today. A large part of what we do is we take on civil rights cases involving cases of discrimination, of racism against Muslims or people perceived to be Muslims. Sadly, in the United States, because of the ignorance that exists, you also have many people who are not Muslims, such as Sikhs who wear the turbans, who are also misidentified and targeted in these hate crime attacks as well. And part of our job is to take on these civil rights cases and defend these people against any type of discrimination that they might feel as well. I of course want to first thank Webster MSA for inviting me here today, and also I want to thank all of you for coming here. I love coming to Webster University because I feel like I'm going to a friend's house. Webster University is not off the highway, it's not in an industrial area, it is in somebody's neighborhood. I just feel like I'm going past house, and then there's the Webster University campus, which just seems to be a series of homes as well. I'm very grateful to be here today, and the topic that we'll be discussing is something very unique and very important for all of us to understand. Its implications are wide and something that maybe is not very well understood. So I'm hoping after this presentation, you will understand what is Islamophobia, where does this come from, how does it impact Americans today, and not only American Muslims, but how does it impact every single person living within inside the United States today, how does it impact policy, political structure within this country, and what are the ramifications of it as well. At the end, we will of course open it up to questions and answers. I want to start off by discussing something very tragic that happened recently. In February, we had a very tragic attack happen where 3 individuals who were going to university at the time were actually shot and murdered inside their home by what you would call like a secular extremist individual. He went inside their home and actually shot a husband and a wife, these 2 are newlyweds, along with their sister inside their home. That is, to me was very troubling because I also remember when I went to university, when I was at that age, and just imagine the type of fear and anger that somebody has to be in to then target 3 young Muslims in that manner is something that really hit not only myself, but hit millions of American Muslims across the United States. This was of course called the Chapel Hill shooting or the Chapel Hill murder, in which these 3 individuals were shot and murdered. What happened after they were shot and murdered is that you had over 7 different attacks against American Muslims happen all across the United States. The most fundamental and the extreme of these attacks was the Houston Mosque fire, which is an Islamic center in Houston was torched and set ablaze. And this is after multiple attempts have been made on this Islamic center, on that Muslim community, trying to attack them, trying to burn down the Islamic center as well. And again, this happened right after these 3 young American Muslim students were murdered inside their homes. You also had multiple Islamic centers being vandalized. You had people spray painting Islamic centers. You had people slashing the tires of American Muslim families. You had people basically beating and attacking one Muslim lady who's wearing a hijab in the street. And you had this happen one after the other, after the other, after the other. But yet the sad reality that we face as American Muslims is that you don't see widespread media coverage of these attacks that happen in perpetuality in one after the other after the other. In fact, I would argue the majority of Americans, even perhaps the students in this room, did not know about the Chapel Hill shooting, or if you know about that, you didn't know about the subsequent attacks that followed it as well. Because what we see happen is that you see within the United States a lot of media coverage and emphasis being put when there is a Muslim or somebody perceived to be Muslim that does any type of attack, especially if it comes to terrorist attacks. But you don't see that same type of coverage or condemnation when it's the opposite of that going on. And this type of attacks against American Muslims has been something that's been growing since, of course, September the 11th. Now, what's unique about Islamophobia that we'll discuss later on is that Islamophobia in this country is not a natural phenomenon. It is not something that's just naturally brewing amongst Americans, that they find more reasons to be afraid and fear Muslims as well. In fact, after September the 11th, we saw something very obvious happen. You saw that the attacks against Islam and Muslims increased after the attacks of September 11th, which is something to be expected. You would expect that when there's an attack against the United States, that those people who are perceived to have done the attack, whether it's right or wrong, would be countered with hatred and bigotry, which is exactly what we saw in the United States. But of course what we saw after that is also very logical, which is that every single year we get away from the actual incident of September 11th. You saw the anti-Islam attacks and bigotry within this country reduce and reduce and reduce. And actually in 2006, this graph, which is from the FBI, shows that in reality it was almost wiped out. That the attacks against Islam and Muslims and hate crimes were almost virtually non-existent, and they were before 2001 rates. But what happened next in 2008, you saw a sharp increase in bigotry and hate crimes against American Muslims. And this begs the question, well, why is it that you would have, of course, an attack occurs, hate crimes increase, then they decrease naturally. But then in 2008, without there being a major incident, without there being a major attack, you see these hate crimes dramatically rise and dramatically go on the uptick. What happened? What changed and what caused this? And this is where we get into what is called the Islamophobia industry as it exists today. And what the Islamophobia industry is that it's a very tight-knit industry of groups of individuals, of foundations, of charities, whose primary purpose is to demonize Islam and Muslims in order to gain either political clout, either to gain wealth, money, and power and influence. And this is what we saw happen. We saw for the first time in 2008, when basically you had a political incentive for Islamophobia within inside this country. As you remember, all of you around in 2008, I don't know how well you remember those elections, but in 2008, the Democrats did a sweeping victory against the Republicans. We had the first black president being elected, which is Barack Obama, and then of course we saw in every level of government, in the House and the Senate, we saw multiple Democrats winning landslide elections, one after the other after the other. And this is, of course, what I believe to be one of the turning points within inside the United States. It was only after 2008, only after this major political victory, that you for the first time saw Islamophobia being used as a tool in the political arena. Before that, you always had Islamophobes and racists, but this is the first time you saw it becoming a political tool. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that you had multiple events take place, all occurring one after the other, that actually increased the level of fear and misunderstanding of Islam within inside this country. One example, of course, is the actual election of President Obama. Many people started to question, is President Obama a closet Muslim? Is he actually a Christian? And of course, those of you who are anti-immigrants, another great field day opportunity as well, because many people start saying that he is not even American. Prove to us that you're American, show us your birth certificate if you really are an American. Right? So you saw this for the first time on national television, this type of debate occurring, which you really didn't see within the time of Bush or within really before that era. Also, during President Obama's election, you saw this film on the right being mass sent out to Americans all across the country. It's called Obsession. You know, at that time, I was at Drake University, and Drake University, for those of you who don't know, is in Iowa, which is a great state when it comes to corn, beef, and of course politics as well. Because Iowa, the only way you're going to become president is you have to win the Iowa caucus. So in Iowa, I remember waking up one day early in the morning. I was one of those crazy people who would wake up like 6 in the morning, going down the stairs and looking at the cubby hole. So if you ever live in a dorm room, you'll basically see you've got a front desk, behind it you've got like the mailboxes for all the students there, right? And every single mailbox had a copy of this film inside of it, which is called Obsession. And Obsession is an extremely Islamophobic film that basically links Islam with Nazism, that links basically this idea that Islam wants to take over the United States, and it was released directly and specifically during this time when Barack Obama was being linked as possibly being an undercover closet secret Muslim as well. And this film, what you realize is there was an institution, a foundation that actually was hiring staff, paying benefits, occupying office space, producing this film, then printing it in bulk, and then mailing it out to literally millions of Americans across the United States during election season as well. So you saw, again, for this first time, a nationwide campaign to really target Islam and Muslims as well. During this same session, we also saw the Ground Zero Mosque controversy. And of course, people have both sides in the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, which, for those of you who don't know, there's an Islamic center that's going to be built around 3 to 4 blocks away from where the Twin Towers had crashed. And many Americans had issues with that. And of course, doing this type of work, I can actually sympathize with those issues as well. That people say you shouldn't build an Islamic center so close to Ground Zero. Of course, there's already another Islamic center much closer to Ground Zero, and for those of you who don't know, the Twin Towers, both of which actually had a prayer hall for Muslims in both of the buildings. But that's beside the point. Let's actually go with this war memorial is being built. But for the first time, you had Americans now beginning to choose which side are you? Are you the one that supports the construction of this Islamic center near the Ground Zero Mosque, or do you not support it? You also had this other very interesting gentleman, Pastor Terry Jones, who runs a church with about him and about 20 other people, who basically had an international Burn the Quran Day. I love the way these people think. They're very, very bold. I think all of us here, we should try to be as bold as well. You should never do a Webster University event. You should do an international event every single time. So this individual with 20 other people, he made headlines and he made massive media waves when he said that he is going to burn the Quran. You also saw something else happen as well, which is for the first time this very new word, a very new concept started becoming in our vocabulary, which is Sharia Law. Right? Sharia law is going to take over the United States Constitution, it's going to take over state law, and actually there are multiple pieces of legislation, including here in the state of Missouri, to actually stop Sharia law from being implemented. For those of you who don't know what Sharia law is, because every time we get a presentation, we always have that question, in Islam you have religious law. Like in Catholicism, you have Catholic law. In Judaism, you have rabbinical law. In every single religious, under every single religion, you have a particular type of religious laws of ethics and morality. That's what Sharia law is. And this, in a very unique concept, there were groups within this country that said that Sharia law is going to take over the United States. And the only way to stop it is to create legislation for the first time that would directly and specifically discriminate against one particular religious group. And Missouri was also one of these states that actually implemented this type of law. This is actually a map right now of basically anti-Sharia legislation. What's unique about this anti-Sharia legislation is that it was designed specifically by a well-known Islamophobe on the left here named David Yoshimi. And in essence, what he wanted to do when he's been interviewed about this is that people would ask him, and journalists would ask him very obviously, this law is obviously unconstitutional. It's never going to pass. Even if it becomes a law, it's never going to actually be enforced within the United States. And he said the goal is not to get these laws to become enforced or not to become enforced. The goal is to create fear of Sharia, of Islam, of that other, of these words that people don't know about, and then to create that discussion and to create that dialogue. And that he was very successful. Inside the United States, you had multiple states producing this anti-Sharia legislation. Legislation that would have, for example, Tennessee, made a felony to basically be a Muslim within the state of Tennessee, punishable by 15 years in state prison. Why am I saying federal prison? And 15 years in prison. This is a crazy piece of legislation. And then, of course, the phobes and the bigots, what they did is they would actually modify the law. Okay, well, the first version of the law is too unconstitutional. Okay, let's rewrite it and say no international law will be allowed and enforceable within the state of Missouri, for example. And of course, my organization, we fought against it, and we said, well, hold on a second. Now, how many of you want to go in business in the future, or want to work for a company or business in the future? Raise your hand. Hopefully all of you, because there's not that many companies, or there's no real jobs out there that's not in the business world. How many of your companies do you think do work in international business? Almost all of them, right? Almost every company does international business. So here's this piece of legislation designed to target Islamic Muslims. In order for them to pass it, they say, okay, no international law will be upheld within the state of Missouri. Well, the problem with that is businesses deal with international law. Especially, for example, all the products made in America, there's a joke that said they're all made in China, right? All of those contracts would then possibly will become unenforceable. So these laws had extreme unintended consequences, which is, what is it going to do? Is it actually going to target Islam, or is it going to basically target businesses and target more things as well? The great thing is most of these laws were defeated and destroyed, and they didn't go anywhere. Thankfully, of course, to many well-minded and well-balanced individuals. You also had a new phenomena existing. Again, in the United States, you'll always, and not in the United States, but everywhere in the world, you'll always have haters, you'll always have bigots, you'll always have phobes, you'll always have racists, no matter what it is. That are not really the problem. The problem is when that type of ideology becomes mainstream. And when it becomes mainstream, that's when it becomes dangerous. That's when it becomes okay to attack Muslims, to attack gays, to attack blacks, to attack any other group you can think of. That's when it becomes okay to do these types of things. There was once upon a time in the United States where it was okay to be blatantly racist, to say things against blacks that if anybody said today, they would, of course, be fired from their job and they would be, yelled at in the public discourse. It was once upon a time in this country where being gay was completely, totally unacceptable. There was once upon a time where being Jewish was unacceptable. Right now, we're living in a stage where attacking Islam and Muslims is actually acceptable, where you will not have a whiplash and a backlash if you do so, or at least not to the extent that you would imagine. What are some evidence of this? Well, you had in, for example, 2012, the presidential election when Barack Obama was versing the Republicans. Are any of you very political? Do you guys watch these types of elections and keep up with it? Do you at least watch The Daily Show? I hope, right? So at least you're keeping up with some of it. Well, what happened is that during this time, American Muslims, we saw something very, very frightening to us. We saw candidates who could potentially become the next president of the United States saying very, very intense and very, very racist and anti-Islamic statements. What are some examples of this? One of these gentlemen is named Peter King. And Peter King, he held hearings at the state capitol called the extent of radicalization of the American Muslim community. Now this was of course very troubling because it's implying that the American Muslim community is already radicalized, that many people within the community want to basically strap on suicide vests, want to blow themselves up, and of course they want to target all our freedom centers out there, which I always thought was very funny. And he held these types of hearings on the state capitol. We had, for example, Herman Cain, when he was asked, would you elect a Muslim to be on your cabinet? And he flat out said, no, I would not elect a Muslim to be on my cabinet. And he got a lot of slack for that. But of course, the reason he said that you just can't trust Muslims. Are they loyal to America, or are they loyal to Islam and the Islamic Khalifa and all these very odd, strange notions? Similar statement that was said about Catholics, especially when John F. Kennedy was running to be the president of the United States. Many people said that, well, you can't have a Catholic be the president of the U.S. because is he going to be loyal to America, or is he going to be loyal to the Pope in Italy, right? So you had something very similar happen to the United States, to Americans as well. You had another elected official when he was asked who should be profiled, right? Who should be profiled? Who should be targeted? And he said very blatantly during a Republican debate that we should profile the Muslims because the Muslims are the terrorists and they're the ones that we really want to stop terrorism in the United States. You need to profile and target American Muslims. Again, this is not some far-right racist person in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, giving a talk. This is on the national stage. The next president of the United States saying the extremely inflammatory and racist thing. Michelle Bachmann, for example, was another individual who basically said about one of the aides of the president who happened to be Muslim, even though she's married to a Jewish but she said that this person is actually an affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood and that they want to take over the White House, and that they're doing it through this process. Very, very out there type of statement. Very things that you really couldn't believe are being said, but yet they're being said, they're being promoted, and they're being promoted in the highest level of government, which is something that should trouble each and every one of us. Because if the highest level of government and the politicians are saying this, then the average American is now hearing it from this high level and now believes that this is true. Now believe that there is this, conspiracy of American Muslims trying to impose Sharia law on the United States, and their American Muslims cannot be trusted, that they have to be profiled, etc., etc. And this is really where it becomes troubling. One of my political jokes that I say, which is not really funny for young people, but it makes older people laugh, is that let's say for the sake of argument that American Muslims do want Sharia law to become the law of the land, right? Let's say this is just for the sake of argument supposed to happen. How is it that less than 1% of the U.S. population, the majority of whom don't even know what Sharia law is, and don't even want or are advocating for Sharia law to become part of the law within the United States, that they would somehow miraculously, over the course of several years, basically replace the United States Constitution and impose Sharia law? If you're a lobbyist, or if you're somebody putting money in politics, Republicans or Democrats, you are putting your money in the wrong group of people. You've got to start putting your money in that group of people, the people that have no political power, no money, no real representation, but yet they're going to take over the United States government. If you put that example for many Christians, for example, and a Christian organization in this country are against abortion, right? They try to create anti-abortion laws within Missouri, within other states as well. And over the last several decades, they've, in essence, utterly failed in their push. Even though there's tens of millions of these people, there's churches, they have money, they have lobbying organizations, they have in essence failed to really get any of their goals and wishes passed. But yet here Muslims are, and they're about to basically overthrow the Constitution and impose Sharia law. If I was a betting man, if I had money, I would definitely bet on the Muslims rather than betting on other groups. But of course, that's a little bit of political. So, where does this hatred come from? It can come from one of two places. It can come from basically in America, you have a general culture that doesn't like Islam and Muslims, is intolerant to American Muslims, and that's an organic growth. But what we found is that's actually not the case. What we discovered is that there is an industry inside the United States whose primary goal, whose primary purpose is to target Islam and Muslims in order to gain political power and in order to gain money as well. How does this end? This industry has been termed Fear Incorporated, or others term it as the Islamophobia Industry. Well, how does the industry work? Well, it works in a very, arguably a very simple but yet effective manner. At the base, you have several foundations and organizations that are basically the money. These are the groups that provide lots of money and lots of wealth for this. In fact, over $126 million has been traced as a least figure, meaning that's not the highest, it's the very least the money that we've been able to track. At least $126 million have been raised for the sole purpose of targeting and demonizing Islam and Muslims inside the United States. Well, how does this work? Basically, you have a series of these organizations that will then fund intermediary sort of expert organizations. These are the ones that create the language. These are the ones that create the dialogue. They're the ones that come up with the slogans of Sharia law taking over the United States and whatnot. So you have this core group of people who are raising the money. They then give that money to expert low-sounding organizations such as the Clinton Project, such as the Middle East Forum, such as the Center for Security Policy, so on and so forth. And as the money goes into these organizations, it is then reused and given to basically what we like to call the inner circle of Islamophobia. Basically, here are 26 different organizations and people who benefit from this funding. And they use that money in order to basically go around the country, hold law enforcement training, hold educational programs, lobby their elected officials, anything you can imagine. They use this money in order to spread and instigate fear and hatred. Some of these people are very unique characters, very, very interesting individuals. One of my favorite is this person, and I think you'll enjoy his story as well. He's been dubbed the Forrest Gump of the Middle East, the Forrest Gump of the Middle East. Why is that? Well, because as a young boy growing up in Palestine, he became a radicalized Muslim Wahhabi jihadi extremist basically at the ripe age of 8 or 9 years old. After that, he joined Hamas after Afterwards, he joined Hezbollah. After that, he joined the Iraqi National Guard. After that, he joined the Pakistani, basically the Taliban there. And he joined a series of very different radical organizations. And as an American, when you hear that, you might be like, oh my God, that's really impressive. I can't believe this young boy joined so many groups. But to put it in an American perspective, it would basically be like me saying this American guy joined the Ku Klux Klan, and then he joined the Black Panthers, and then he joined a group that bombed abortion clinics, and then he joined the FBI, and then he joined the United Kingdom's Secret Service, then he joined Mossad. And you'd be like, wait, what? How can somebody join the Ku Klux Klan, and then join the FBI, and then join Mossad? These groups have nothing in common. They don't work with together. In fact, they actually fight and argue, and they actually work against each other. So this young man at the age of 8 or 9 did an amazing feat, which he basically got sheep, strapped bombs on them, and then strapped himself onto a sheep. He then went and took those sheep to blow up an Israeli bank. Of course, after the bomb went off, he was arrested by Israelis, sent to prison, and then somehow got out of prison, came to the United States in order to basically do another series of terrorist attacks in the US. Luckily, of course, one day while going to train to be a terrorist, he basically got hit by a vehicle. He got hit, he was involved in a car accident while crossing the road. Luckily, the person driving the car was a good Christian doctor who basically picked him up, put him in the car, took him home, and healed him at his house. Some people call that kidnapping, but that's beside the point. So this good Christian doctor picks up this young man, brings him to his home, tells him about the good word of Jesus Christ, and this person, in essence, this Sunni radical jihadist, who was part of Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, all these different terrorist groups, then sees the Holy Ghost, sees Jesus Christ, and now is ex-Muslim extremist, who basically goes around the country and telling this story to people. If any of you found that story to be a little bit ridiculous, that's because it is very, very, very ridiculous. In fact, Anderson Cooper of CNN went to Palestine and spoke with his family and says, this guy like a radical, this guy a terrorist? They're like, no, he wasn't a radical, a terrorist, he just grew up here, he made this entire story. His own family members are saying this. But this person is going across the country, being paid literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to give sold-out talks. Even in Kansas City, he came and gave a sold-out talk to the mayor's basically interfaith dinner that they do every single year. So these are the type of cats and people that we're dealing with. People who are very, very anti-Islam, anti-Muslim, and so this is how their industry works. With that, you also have what we call the echo chamber. So you have the people who actually provide the money. Then in between, you have the experts that create the language, and then you have literally hundreds or thousands of people across the United States that will then take that message and then just repeat it again and again and again. Some of these are political figures, some of these are professional Islamophobes, some of these are also news stations such as, for example, if you watch Fox News, there's always a lot of, unfortunately, fairly anti-Islamic coverage on Fox and these other news stations as well. And this creates an echo chamber. So by the time you hear it from one of these individuals, they are saying that they got from an expert organization that's been funded by another, charity as well. And by following the money, we discovered that there is a very intense, a very orchestrated effort within this country to demonize Islam and Muslims for, of course, political reasons, for, of course, financial reasons as well. One example is this gentleman, his name is Daniel Pipes. And so this is one guy, one organization. And what he's doing with his organization is he is now funding a series of other organizations and groups, such as the ones listed here. So you have one man funding a series of other organizations, and what you find is that this individual, Daniel Pipes, is also on the board or also the chair of these other organizations as well. So he is funding other organizations that in fact he is the one that's running them also. And what this does is it really creates confusion. You might hear a statement about Islam or Muslims from a very well-sounding organization, such as the Middle East Forum, for example. That sounds very legitimate, it sounds like it's coming from a very scholarly source, but actually is part of this large Islamophobia industry that we see and experience today. Now, of course, I mentioned this multiple times, but what are the benefits? Who particularly benefits from this type of thing? Well, first and foremost, you find political benefit from this. Unfortunately, what we see with the GOP today is that you see, not all, but you see a lot of GOP candidates using Islam, using this type of fear in order to mobilize people, in order to win elections, in order to really create wedge issues. Right now, the United States is going through very severe political issues, and it's also going through a lot of structural issues. What do I mean by that? We have issues with education in the United States. We have issues with healthcare within the United States. We have infrastructure that's really falling apart within the United States. We have student debt crisis within this country. We have wars that have been going on now for over a decade with really no end in sight. To solve those problems is actually quite difficult. And to be fair, it's really not going to be that easy to solve these problems. It's much easier to be an elected official and not discuss these problems, but say, the real problem is with radical Islamic extremists that happen to be in this country, with Sharia law trying to take over the country, with basically all women being forced to wear the niqab and burqa, even though most Muslim women don't even wear the niqab and burqa. So you see this political push, and unfortunately it's very, very effective. If any of you watched CPAC recently, which is basically the conservative convention that just happened recently, which every single Republican was a part of, one of the main components that was used again and again and again was this threat of Islamic radicalization within inside this country, this threat of Muslim extremists, this threat of Sharia law. You just heard it again and again and again from Muslims, Islamists, extremists, and so on and so forth. And what that does is that it is a very powerful, a very good scapegoat in order to really rally people, rally voters, in order to vote you into office as well. Another challenge we see is within the media. Of course, many people, they have a misunderstanding of what the term media. The media is a very broad term, but what happens is that the media, in essence, needs to make money. The media needs to make money. They need to sell airtime. One of the greatest ways to sell airtime today is if there is an attack or any type of situation that occurs that involves a Muslim, especially if they're part of some type of terrorist group or organization. If that happens in this country or anywhere in the world, that becomes front page news, and it really is run for days or weeks on end. You have policy being discussed. For example, Charlie Hebdo, which is a very egregious attack that happened against a satirical magazine in France. This created international news and worldwide condemnation that you saw happening, and rightfully so. But at the same time, we're living in an age where you see genocide happening across the world. For example, in the Central African Republic, you see right now, today there's just a report released that basically almost 100% of all the Muslims living in the Central African Republic have either been killed, their mosques have been basically destroyed. It's being called a genocide by the United Nations and others as well, and basically all the Muslims have been forced to leave that country. It is, in essence, what ISIS is doing in Iraq and Syria with the Christians in that area, but this is to a much more extreme extent, and it's much more effective because almost all the Muslims have now been kicked out of this country. You also see, for example, in Burma, you see Buddhist, very extreme Buddhist nationalists committing genocide against the Muslims living within that part of the world as well. And you see multiple Islamic being destroyed. You see hundreds of thousands of people being killed in these, not 100,000, you see 10,000 people being killed within these areas, but it doesn't create the same type of media coverage. You don't really see that type of media coverage happening within the United States as well. Why? Because that just doesn't sell. That type of messaging doesn't sell. But if you have a terrorist attack, if you have a bombing, if you can put Muslim extremists, radical Islamists, then that becomes hot news, becomes front page news, and it is something that you can show over and over and over and over again. When I started this presentation, I spoke about the Chapel Hill shooting. 3 university students being killed by a far, you could say left secular individual in their homes, one after the other. And the way the media covered it is they covered it by saying this was possibly caused by a parking dispute, first and foremost. And then you also saw something much more egregious, which is that you actually had media outlets talking about the good things that this murderer did. You had one media outlet that said, well, he might have killed these people and he might have been racist against all religions, but he would have died defending the right for people to practice their religion. This was on the Associated Press as well, that this person hated all religion, but he believed in liberty and he believed in that people have the right to practice their religion. Really odd type of reporting that's being done in these types of cases. So what happens is you see media outlets, not because that they're out to get Islam Muslim, which unfortunately a lot of the conspiracy theory that exists today, but really because that does sell, that is controversial. it is something that people want to hear about. People are genuinely afraid inside the United States and other areas when it comes to ISIS and ISIL and these types of groups, but probably none of you can name the extremist groups in CAIR who are basically, destroying the Muslim Islamic centers there and have committed genocide and committed almost total ethnic cleansing of that country. Probably none of you can name these groups because that is not really what is politically motive, what really sells. Another issue we see in politics is that Islamophobia, or terrorism more specifically, is used to create particular laws within this country that actually attack and destroy civil liberties within this country. Osama bin Laden is not going to take away your civil liberties in the United States. He is not, and Taliban and Al-Qaeda, though they're a egregious organization, they kill innocents, I'm not trying to say anything good about them, but they are not going to destroy American liberty. They're not going to attack the United States Constitution. They have no capacity to do so. But yet, but by their existence, they are used as an excuse in order to curtail freedom that many of us used to enjoy within this country today. All of us here, we have less freedoms today than we had before September 11th. A simple example is that of the Patriot Act, which for the first time allows the United States government to arrest anybody in any part of the world for an indefinite period of time without ever bringing up charges against that person. Another example is Guantanamo Bay, that some people, they just don't have the right to actually have a trial to be brought in court. Another example that all of us here are now facing, but Muslims, we've been facing this since 2001 and 2002, is the mass surveillance of every single American. After September 11th, you had massive surveillance of the Muslim community. In fact, recently we saw from the NYPD all the results of what does it mean to basically be part of a community that's surveilled. You have literally thousands of photos of NYPD and FBI agents sitting in front of falafel stands, right? Sitting in front of the hookah lounge, sitting in front of, these places where, young Muslims go to hang out, eat, the shawarma place, these types of places, taking photos every single day because that's part of their counterterrorism effort. But what happened is that you had this type of policy targeting specifically the American Muslim community, but now it is grown as now targeting every single American. Every single American, each one of you that use a cell phone, that use the internet, now we all know that the NSA does widespread tapping and now monitors all of our actions on the internet and these areas. How is that possible? It's not because, Osama bin Laden did something that basically took away your civil liberties. It's that the excuse of Islamic radicalism, the overblowing of this Islamic terrorist, is a tool that allows particular branches of our government and particular areas within our country to gain power, to gain more authority, which is why you now see massive surveillance of basically all of us here after the fact that Muslims were first targeted and now every American is targeted. This is the long-term goal because the main purpose of an executive branch of law enforcement of these types of agencies is to be able to have more power, to be able to really surveil, and the limits that we put on these agencies from judges, from courts, from constitution, that's why we have a constitution, is to limit what they can do. But when you have a threat, when you have something that's ominous and something that is right out there, it allows for those people in power to use this as an excuse to really increase their power, increase its influence, which is what we've seen over the last several years. One of the most egregious areas where this happened is within the FBI, specifically their counterterrorism task force. This is somewhat of a controversial statement, but I really do enjoy talking about it. Let's say all of you are FBI agents. Let's say all of you now are part of the FBI. Congratulations, you're now making at least $60,000 a year, and you're part of probably the most awesome organization that people want to be a part of in the world, is second to Google and I think one other company that I'm not forgetting. So now say, you are all FBI agents. If your job is to counter narcotics in this country, you would know what to do. Because there are people right now in St. Louis that are selling drugs, illegal, explicit. If your goal is to fight gang violence, if your job was to fight prostitution, any of these types of normal things that you're required to counter, sex trafficking, human trafficking, you would have an idea on how to counter that. Because you see it happening rampant. And in fact, it's so rampant, if any of you wanted it, it's very easy to take. But let's say your job is now to fight Islamic extremism inside the United States. How would you do that? How would you go about fighting it, let's say within the city of St. Louis, for example? The city of St. Louis has about 100,000 Muslims. So how would you, right now today, being an FBI agent, target and fight target and fight radicalization within inside the city of St. Louis? And also another question I would like to ask is, how many terrorists from the Muslim community are in St. Louis? Well, the reality is that there just are not that many extremist radical cell groups within St. Louis or actually in the United States in general. You don't have within the Muslim community or really within any community massive population of people want to join Al-Qaeda and these other types of extremist groups and want to blow themselves up or blow up the ark or these types of things. You just don't have that happening on a wide scale. But let's say your job is now you're a full-time FBI agent, your full-time job is to fight this type of terrorism that exists within this country. What would you do? Well, what we've seen happen is because there is not really that much to do, you see the FBI within St. Louis, within New York, within actually every city inside the United States, start targeting the entire Muslim community. What they do is they go on what are called fishing expeditions, which is very scary if you're part of it. Basically, they'll come, they'll knock on your door, and there'll be 2 FBI agents there, and they'll basically say, we are here to talk to you. We just want to speak to you about X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be. And what they're doing is they're going from one Muslim to another, to another, to another, to another, visiting them at the workplace, visiting them at their school, visiting them, wherever you can imagine, and really trying to create these large conspiracies that do you know this person who knows this person whose roommate used to be Osama bin Laden, right? So you see this really massive type of strategy going on. You also see the FBI hiring basically informants. These are basically sometimes criminals, sometimes murderers, sometimes ex-rapists, ex-convicts, and they're paying them sometimes $10,000, sometimes $15,000 per head, as you could say. Basically, if you're an FBI informant and you're able to help the FBI catch a Muslim radical extremist before he does a crime, then you'll be given $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 in cash. And what we've seen happening in the United States is you see multiple cases of basically the FBI creating the very terrorists that their goal and their purpose is to fight. And there have been multiple documentaries. Even this is a very interesting photo about the sting and how the FBI created a terrorist. And what they normally do is that they'll go into the American Muslim community and they'll find people who are maybe mentally ill or people who are not really attacked, very young people, very impoverished people and poor people. And what they do is that they will first pay an informant whose full-time job it is to first radicalize that person. Say, don't you see what America is doing to our brothers and sisters here? Don't you see what they're doing to our brothers and sisters in Egypt? Don't you see what they're doing here and there? Don't you see that these people are the infidels? That they're, all this stuff, and this goes on for weeks and months at a time. And then what you see happening is that you see the informant is the one that gives this individual the idea to blow something up. The informant is also the one who we found cases will actually pick the person up, bring them into their car, drive them to the location, give them the bomb, pay them the money, and say, press this button, blow yourself up, and then you will get another, $100,000 if you do so. Like really and of course, I'm not trying to say these people are justified in their right in what they're doing. They're not. The crime that they're doing is still a crime. But the question I have to ask is that would these people do a crime if they were not coerced and coached into doing so? We had, for example, one case in Missouri actually, in, what's the city called? I think Cape Girardeau actually, where you had this young individual, very poor individual from Bangladesh. Basically this individual was radicalized by an FBI informant who was an ex-convict in Cape Girardeau. He was then flown to New York City. He was then offered basically at $20,000, $30,000 to go blow something up. And then of course the young man said, well, I don't even have a car. Well, the guy said, well, don't worry, we'll pick you up, we'll drive you, we'll give you the bomb, we'll take you there, we'll give you the bag, and we'll have you do this attack as well. So what you see happening is you see many of these incidents occurring across the United States. As CAIR, we've also taken on cases of ex-FBI informants who are now suing the FBI, who are now actually bringing up legal charges against the FBI for basically putting them in this type of situation. Some of them were even told to sleep with Muslim women. Some of them were told to basically do whatever it takes to be accepted by the American Muslim community, find people, make them radicalized, and do these types of things. And this, of course, very troubling as well, because now this means that every single American Muslim is now has the potential of having the FBI come knock at your door and question you about your involvement in some type of really crazy terrorist plot, or worse yet, that the person you might be speaking to at your mosque, at the Islamist, at this event even, they might be a paid informant who's recording everything you're saying and recording this information. That way they can use it inside of a federal indictment. And we've had multiple people being now put into 50, 20, 30 years in federal prison as a result of these FBI stings. People who in reality, it's very hard to know if they would have done or tried to do that crime if it wasn't for the FBI coasting it as well. Of course, you might ask, well, why does the FBI do this? Again, put yourself back in this predicament. The FBI, along with multiple other law enforcement agencies, along with Department of Defense, are receiving hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars from the government to fight terrorism, to fight extremism out there. And they have to show some type of result. They have to show that they are actually fighting it. And if you can't do that, then your funding will be cut. So you see every few months this type of thing occurring as well. I think with that, I'm going to try to wrap it up. The results of this are quite troubling. You have 55% of Americans in this country, in essence, saying that they would not trust Muslims to be in political office. You have large groups of American Muslims, Americans actually allowing for this type of Islamophobic rhetoric to be used within inside this country as well. But of course, what can we do about it? I would recommend three main things. Number one, recognize that this is a problem. It is a problem. It has very real consequences. Islamic centers are being targeted. They're being bombed. People are being killed out there for being Muslim, for being American. And the entire American Muslim community is being targeted as well. Number two, understand what's happening. Where is this coming from? It is not an organic flow from this country, but rather it is a very orchestrated, well-funded industry that is promoting this and is financially benefiting from it as well. And of course, then admitting and then countering it by doing these types of talks, by holding these types of educational workshops where you can understand the problem, and then of course, inshallah, God willing, one day be able to tackle those problems as well. With that, I will conclude and I will open it up for